Welcome back to chessopenings.com. Today's video is all about the Pirc opening, which begins with the moves e4 and pawn to d6. And with this modest looking move, what black is looking to do is develop his pieces as quickly as possible and keep the white center restrained. Only later will he plan a counterattack against the center. Let's take a look. The Pirc defense begins with the moves pawn to e4 and pawn to d6. Now right away, black is doing something a little audacious. He's allowing white an opportunity to occupy the center with the strong move pawn to d4. And unlike other openings where black allows white to do this, black's strategy is to leave the center unchallenged for quite some time to come. Instead, black will use what's called a hyper-modern strategy. That is to say, he'll focus on developing his pieces quickly, let's say knight f6, g6, bishop g7. He's going to focus on developing his pieces quickly, restraining the opponent's center, and only later does he plan to use his piece pressure plus pawn strikes such as c5 or pawn to e5 to launch a counterattack in the center. White, on the other hand, is going to try to maintain this powerful center that he has, this powerful duo in the center, and at the same time he wants to complete his development and then systematically advance the center forward into the opponent's position. So, after the move pawn to d4, black now plays knight to f6. And black's first move in the Pirc, pawn to d6, is actually designed to prevent e4 to e5 here. It makes it so that this knight to f6 is much more stable. If white tries the move pawn to e5, just to show how this works, black would profit now from the fact that he can exchange on e5 with pawn takes pawn on e5, pawn takes pawn, and now he would simply win material with the moves queen takes queen on d1 and king takes queen, and then simply knight g4 attacking both f2 and e5. So clearly, the move pawn to e5 is out of the question. Instead, what white needs to play in this position is knight to c3, simply defending the e4 pawn. Now black plays pawn to g6, and with this move, he's looking to develop the bishop to g7, complete his kingside development, and train the bishop towards the center. This position is the main starting point of the modern Pirc opening. Black's plan of playing bishop g7 and castles kingside, and then chipping away at the center with this move pawn to c5 or perhaps pawn to e5, is fairly straightforward here. White, on the other hand, has a few different strategies which he can choose from. One idea, for example, would be to advance pawn to f4, and this is known as the Austrian attack, aiming to one day play that move e4 to e5 anyway, and start a violent attack later in the game. Of course, the drawback of this strategy is that white is spending even more time on pawn moves, and this means that black's counterattack may be more successful if black can deliver the blow in time. Another strategy for white is simply the calm development strategy, knight f3, and then simply bishop e2 followed by castling kingside, and this is known as the classical setup, and this is also an option for white. But today we're going to check out a highly interesting system known as the 150 attack, and that begins with the move bishop to e3. Now, with the move bishop e3, white is signaling a number of important things, which we'll get to in just a moment. However, at the moment, I just want to point out that white is making it more difficult for black to achieve the move pawn to c5, since the bishop is now bringing that square under observation. Also, white is signaling that he plans to develop his queenside pieces, castle the king on the queen side, and then to play for a pawn storm attack on the king side. In fact, this so-called 150 attack has now been widely recognized as one of white's very best options against the Pirc opening. Over time, many master players handling the black pieces have felt so intimidated by the attack white gets in this system that they've searched for methods to avoid castling kingside, or even they've avoided fianchettoing the bishop. For this reason, some players have begun playing with the move pawn to c6, and then after queen d2, black simply plays pawn to b5, threatening to oust this knight on c3 and attack this pawn on e4. So, to cover the e4 pawn, white simply plays bishop d3, when black replies with his own simple developing move, knight b to d7. And black's idea here is to get a little head start on attacking the queenside, and this will make castling queenside somewhat less attractive for white. Another benefit of this setup is that by avoiding bishop g7, black has avoided the standard exchanging maneuver bishop h6, which we'll get a chance to see in just a moment. Of course, there are also some real drawbacks to black's strategy here as well. If white simply remains calm and plays something like knight f3 followed by castling kingside, he does lose some of his capacity for an attack on the kingside, but he can reason that he's achieved a little lead in development, and he still maintains his center pawns, and perhaps these pawns on the queen side will turn out to be weakened one day. This plan of c6 and b5 is interesting, but ultimately white can still count on an advantage in these positions. Now let's take a look at the more natural move, bishop to g7, to find out how white still builds his attack there. Now white can simply go ahead with the move queen to d2, but often he likes to start with the move pawn to f3 so that he never has to worry about knight g4 after the move queen d2. Another strong point about the move pawn to f3 is that white is starting to support his kingside pawn storm. He's ready to start looking for g2 to g4 and h2 to h4. So this is also a strategically helpful move for white. Now, once again, if he'd like, black can delay or even just get rid of the concept altogether of castling his king by simply playing pawn to c6. But ultimately, after the move queen d2 and b5, white gets a pleasant game after either g4 or simply even castling kingside. Now, it may appear that black has a little bit of a head start on the queenside attack in this position. However, because black has already played bishop g7 in this position, bishop h6 will be much stronger when white achieves it. Instead, after the move f2 to f3, black often prefers to castle kingside. And let's recall that in doing this, black is simply sticking with his overall opening strategy of developing quickly and then striking against the center later. Many games have eventually demonstrated, however, that white gets great attacking chances here, but many players handling the black pieces still aim for this traditional setup. The idea is that after white's standard play, queen to d2, black begins a counterstrike in the center with pawn to e5, knight g to e2, and then knight to c6, putting pressure on the d4 point. And from this position, white has a couple different ways of building his attack. For example, d4 to d5 is a definite possibility here. But the simplest approach is probably simply castles kingside, just leaving this tension alone in the center and completing development. And now white is very primed to begin launching his attack with the move g2 to g4 as soon as he gets the opportunity. To show an example of how white's attack comes together, after the popular move a6 preparing b5, white can continue with his stock move g2 to g4, beginning the sharp attack on black's king. Black plays b5, and black's idea is simply to play b4 and to bring those pawns forward in search of an attack on the queen side. But it's now at this moment that white plays d5. And now, no matter whether black plays the knight to e7 or to a5, white will continue with the move knight g3, and he's getting very close to the big attack idea, which is simply h4 and h5, beginning to open lines and create a critical attacking condition for white here. At the same time, white has also, with his last move, uncovered the bishop on f1, so that if the knight were to try to sink itself into c4, white would simply capture the knight and then get on with his ambitions on the king side. These positions are so dangerous for black that we might even go so far as to say that he's close to being objectively lost. And it's positions like these that have modern grandmasters so enthusiastic about white's chances in the so-called 150 attack. Realistically, after white has castled on the queen side, black probably needs to try another strategy rather than that straightforward move pawn to a6. Therefore, another popular attempt has been pawn takes pawn on d4, knight takes pawn on d4, knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, and now bishop to e6. And by bringing about some exchanges, black has freed his position a bit and no longer has to worry about d4 to d5, since he's exchanged the pawn off on d4. However, white still has plenty of scope for a kingside attack, whereas black is a long ways away from creating real threats against white's king. In positions where both sides castle on opposite sides of the board, attacking the king is the essential strategy, and black is still probably going a little bit too slowly here. So white simply continues with the move g2 to g4. And now, to deploy his queen to an aggressive post, black plays c5, and after bishop e3, he plays queen a5. And there are fascinating complications ahead. If white tries to take on d6, he actually will find himself in big trouble after the outstanding move knight takes e4, a sharp tactical blow which wins in all variations. For example, if white plays pawn takes knight on e4, he immediately runs into bishop takes c3. And now if he were to try to recapture this bishop, he would simply lose after queen a3 check. If white moves the king to d2, which would be the only move here actually, black would of course play rook a d8, picking up the queen. And if the king moves to b1, there's the standard mating procedure. Bishop takes a2 check, king a1, bishop b3 check, king b1, and it will be mate on c2. So, white cannot recapture on c3, and this means that he is simply going to be down in material in this position. The other option would be knight takes e4. However, after knight takes e4, black plays rook f to d8, and no matter where we bring the queen, we're going to get hit with the same tactical blow. For example, after queen g3, it's lights out after bishop takes b2 check, and after king takes b2, queen takes a2 check, and now it's going to be mate next move, either king c3, queen a3 mate, or king c1, queen a1 mate. Then if white were to take on c5 with the queen, rather than moving the queen to g3, it would still be lights out, with bishop takes b2 check, king takes b2, queen takes a2. And now, in this situation, black doesn't have the simple mate queen a3 mate, but he is still completely winning after the move rook takes d1, when he has just way too many threats in this position, and the material is roughly equal, so white is simply lost. So, white can definitely not take the pawn on d6, but the general consensus here is still that black is in quite a bit of danger, and what white will simply do in this position is bishop h6, or perhaps he'll do something about the a2 pawn with king b1 or a3, and each of these strategies still leaves white with an initiative, my favorite being bishop to h6. And even though black is in quite a bit of danger in this position as well, his position is much more solid than the disastrous scenarios we saw when he tried to play the straightforward a6 and b5 in the previous positions that we looked at. Well, once again, keep in mind that grandmasters today often avoid these kinds of positions by either refusing to castle or even sometimes refusing to fianchetto the dark squared bishop even after black has played the move pawn to g6. As we've seen, black is just a couple natural developing moves away from an incredibly dangerous situation, and so many club players will fall into this situation. That's it for today, and I'll see you again soon.